Welcome to Commsverse. This session is how to manage and maintain large organizations with Michael Pletner. Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Adam. So welcome to you. Good morning, good evening, whatever time zone you are. So I just want to start with a really big thank you to all the sponsors for this huge event. You have may seen a couple of, maybe a dozen of sessions already. It wouldn't be possible if you haven't had so incredible sponsors here. We came together from the whole world, and so you can see huge sponsors, company names here, all related to Microsoft Teams. Just check them out. There are some booths in the tenant as well. Check the VR area out and see what's going on with all the events and get the information right from the vendors. As I mentioned it before, my name is Michael Pletner. I'm a CEO and co-founder of a small company named Into Success. I'm a host of the Teams user group in Munich, co-founder of the Adoption and Change Forum in Munich. And on my daily basis, I'm doing projects in bigger organizations, in large and global scale organizations, actually. Doing Microsoft UC, then more than 12, 13, 14 years. And have done multiple deployments, always with a focus to adopt the technical stuff, but also bring the users to the technic or the product, however the name is. And so I would like to share some experiences with you when we talk about enterprise organizations. Basically, when you start to think about administration, when you start to think about maintenance or managing something, you always think about I can use a script or something like that, or maybe a command-led, a PowerShell command-led. But those things are basically just manual things you can do in small organizations where you have not the global challenges like different time zones. When you start to change something, you have to consider, is there a user currently active, who is currently affected when I start to change something? You do have just a small team around you, maybe, who can fix this, and when you break something, or you do something and you leave the company because you said, okay, good night for today. And in 2 or 3 hours, you get the experience there's something broken. Then you don't get the knowledge in another place, just or in another region to help this. So you have some issues when you start to think about the global level and the larger companies. Usually you also have some administrative limitations, restrictions, because in larger enterprise organizations, you have a specific role for which matches to your responsibility in the company. Usually if you're let's say, Teams administrator, you are probably not the right person or not the person with the permissions to change Exchange settings or global tenant settings. Maybe you are, then you are a lucky one, or not so lucky one. But you still have to consider, if I change something here, does it affect another team member and the other side of the world? And that's something I would like to combine in a single statement. Teams is not a tool handled by a single person or a traditional team, and that's a fact. You are not doing it on your own. You're not doing it for an enterprise level of company as a single person, even not as a single team member. As I mentioned before, time zones are the most obvious reasons for not doing this. Otherwise, you're working the whole week from very early morning to the late evening or even night, and you have 2 or 3 hours to sleep per day. And you have to think about the full stack of service. So if you're doing some changes in the network area, for example, and you're doing it on your local intranet network connectivity to a centralized internet breakout, for example, you have to think about all the other services which are stored not in your location or not in your headquarter anymore. They are located in the cloud. So you have to provide an internet connection for the whole time when some users are currently working on it. And there are so many different tools involved when we talk about Teams, especially Teams as a hub for teamwork. You get so many tools involved, from very obvious tools like Planner, Forms, but also in the back end, you get Exchange, SharePoint, you get something like Azure AD in the back end. So you have to think about the whole stack. Where are the identities coming from? How will they be transformed or sent to the cloud to get the users in the cloud active and ready? So you have to think about not just a single product. You have to think about the whole service, and that's something what requires a completely mind change. You have to rethink all you already know about the services in local deployment. If you have a traditional product like Skype for Business, Exchange on premises, or something like that, you just can start with your servers, and you maybe plan some downtimes, and you are the responsible for the service. But now you have a service which is a door opener to so many other different services, like Planner, like conversations, conferencing join, like handling files in the back end. And that's something you have to be aware of. You are not just the one who is responsible for the chat client anymore. You're responsible for the collaboration tool, the main collaboration tool in your company. So think about the full stack of the service. You should start with internal communication for any changes or any maintenance tasks, like, as I mentioned before, changes on an internet connection, whatever it is, proxy, direct internet access, provider changes, changing bandwidth, or whatever it is. You have to start to bring the communication into the responsible co-workers, or to the responsible co-workers. In this case, it's not necessary to write an email, a newsletter, or something like that to just announce it, or send a huge mail to the whole IT department. But when you're aware of the full service stack, you are able to identify the most important persons for any change. So that's something you can identify and then address all the changes you would like to make and make them aware of. And also you can and you should start a kind of change board to get any feedback from the other persons who are involved with the change on their end. So once again, if someone changes in Exchange, just the for example, cumulative updates installation over a weekend, it takes time, and you may get some service interruptions. But if someone is telling you this before this happens, you are aware of it, and you can react also for the users and give some information to the users. When we talk about global teams, usually in large organizations, you have multiple teams who are responsible for the IT, and it depends on the user, on the person in this local IT department and the focus they are working on. For example, you have multiple departments, IT departments, beside the headquarter, who are just responsible for the client, for the end user, not for any backend service. Or you just have some person, have a person who's responsible for the internet connection network, for example, or for contracting, whatever. But you can use these people who are aware of all the technical stuff, all the information, and to have a relationship to some technical background to address your changes, and not only changes, but also for any new features, something they should know, and you should train them on a regular basis. Also, the recommendation, implement a regular call like every second week or once in a month. So that definitely makes sense to address these changes also to the whole global team. And then, if you are aware of those limitations from the other IT people, you should maybe think about some workarounds, some to provide them some helpful tools, scripts, workarounds, documentation, whatever it is, to bring up the full set of service or a full set of capabilities, but on a very easy way to use. So you're able to provide some maybe self-written scripts with a UI to make it really straightforward and easy for all the users, for all the IT person in your subsidiary to create it, whatever it is. For example, a team, or just as an example, just via an UI, and you are the responsible person to configure the tool, the script, to avoid any harm issues. I said it before, think about the stack, the full service stack. And you're not the only one who is involved into this thing like teams. You are responsible for the service teams. Yeah, that's fine, but who's responsible for the service, for the licenses? Who is responsible for Exchange? Who is responsible for the network? Who is responsible for SharePoint? Who is responsible for some security settings like MFA, multi-factor authentication, or conditional access? So you should have a plan, an idea how the service should be in different scenarios, from the internet, you should be aware of the limitations. If you just want to restrict the access from your internet, that's fine. You can do it with conditional access. Pretty easy. But then you should be aware of it, instead of the users mentioning, oh, I'm not able to work from home because I don't have a VPN client or whatever. So when we start to think about the service teams, then you should start to involve all the people and plan the full stack from the very below, from the very beginning to the end. Microsoft has a great picture for that. So Microsoft identified the service management categories, and they also identified the responsibilities. And you see the biggest responsibilities are at the customer side. You have to monitor the service health, manage organizational changes, Teams usage, network quality, assets, endpoints, teams, and the user sentiment. And all this stuff is part of your service. Think about the whole stack. It also includes the devices. When we talk about global scale, you just don't want to do it on a manual way. Everything you're currently responsible for. That's why you think not just for the whole stack or about the whole stack, you also should think about the whole life cycle process. And the life cycle process is something which quite often just start with the beginning and then ends. Nothing happens with anything what's already created. No end of the life cycle. Nothing when the job is done. However, for example, for teams. So it's pretty common to create a process to create teams. But what happens when the purpose of the team is fulfilled? Think about that. What happens to the data? Who is responsible for the data? Is there any automatical backup mechanism behind that? Is it something we have to implement? Is what happens when a single owner is in the team? Actually, it's not a recommendation. A single owner is in a team and he leaves the company. What happens to the team? So you have to rethink about the whole life cycle process. And Teams is just an example for the users as well. So for example, what happens to a user who is coming into the company on his first day? Is he able to use Teams? I hope so. Will he get a headset? I hope so. What happens to the device when it's broken? What happens if the user is moving from one location to the other and maybe get relocated from one country to another? What happens to a user who's leaving the company? And the more tricky question is, what happens to a user who's leaving the company just for a specific time frame? For example, he got a kid, a child, or a baby, whatever the right term is. And then he is off for a couple of weeks, months, or even years, and he will come back. What happens to all the data, the responsibility for a team? What happens to these licenses? And when we remove the licenses, what happens to the data in the backend? And last but not least, when we talk about Teams and telephony, what happens to a telephone number? Is it fine to assign a telephone number? Yeah, if I would like to have the user calling out and get some calls, of course. When he leaves the company, is it fine to assign the same number to a random person? Maybe, maybe not. Is it fine to assign this person to a substitute or to someone in the same team, in the same department? A new one in the department, just keep it on hold until someone new is coming into the department. What happens to the global scale? Who's responsible for local telephone numbers? What happens when the telephone number will change? Maybe also you get additional phone numbers. Who's responsible to add them? Who will decide what happens to the telephone number from the local managing director, for example? That's something you have to identify. That's something you have to think from the lifecycle perspective when you start with a service. Also, what happens with tickets? Usually you have your core team into maybe the headquarter, and this is located in the US. Now you have some issues in APAC. Most of the US people are not at work anymore, not in regular business hours. What happens to those issues and tickets created in APAC? Who's responsible for that? Is there any emergency phone number? Is there anything you can rely on when your local IT persons are not available anymore? Do you may have the chance to get some events from devices like gateways, or even from the Azure AD Connect? Is there any chance to identify, take a look into event logs, and then get the information out of the event logs and use them as a trigger for some automated actions, whatever the action is? But you have to identify, is there any chance to automate some solutions, some restrictions, not restrictions, some solutions and some fixes for some maybe regular events? For example, the service of the Azure AD Connect is stopping randomly, and you are not able to build up a new service, a new server for whatever reason. Then maybe it makes sense to create a watcher who will restart the service just after he's broken. And last but not least, very important, create scripts. Never do it on a manual way, like checking out docs.microsoft.com. Every time you want to create a new team, or you want to create a new user, add a license, or whatever you want to do, yes, PowerShell is good, or even Graph maybe is good. You can use so many different ways to address some automatic processes over there. Use scripts for them, and don't make it just for a single user. Make it available with some intelligence behind that. Create functions, create variables, make it reusable with smaller functions, and don't create the same script or 80% of the script again and again when you can use external functions for that. Think about them and address them properly. Last but not least, that sounds pretty easy, but it's not pretty common. Use standards. Identify your standards. Like I do have a kind of location, this size, this number of users in it. Use this standard for deployment procedure, for an onboarding procedure, offboarding procedure, whatever it is, and decide maybe is there a specific group of users where you can address a specific kind of pre-configured settings or headset or whatever it is. Identify standards and try to address them on a global level, and maybe adjust them for different regions. Of course, it's completely different for something which is pretty fine in the US, but it's maybe not working in APAC. If there's a cultural barrier in there, then you maybe have to adjust the standard, but you can make it still as a standard for APAC, for example. When you start with a service like Teams, you have to create trust. And this trust is not only the service is running, everything is fine, but also the IT is not limiting the users. It's something you get really often in larger organizations. The users think, oh my God, I'm not able to work anymore. I'm not able to do what I would like to do. I'm not able to empower the organization. So you have to establish a trust that the users are able to do all the stuff that they would like to do to bring the ideas into the company, but also do it on a safe and on the right way for the IT department. So establish a feedback for the IT, for the users, and get some feedback. Is it good how it is right now? Shall we change something? Shall we address something new to the IT? I mentioned it before, so I just jumped over it. Train the local IT support. They have to be aware of all the maybe upcoming issues, address those topics, and address also your local contact, who will be the right person in this subsidiary, who will be the responsible for the service in a subsidiary, and give them, enable the person to fulfill the requirements by granting permissions. Sounds easy, but there are so many different roles, from Intune management to Teams configuration, Azure AD, and maybe just read permissions can help in some situations. So identify the right role via RBAC, and maybe also establish a service like privileged identity management, which allows you to grant permissions on a request. Maybe the supervisor can grant permissions via PIM, privileged identity management, or address some enforce the person who is asking for administrative writing permissions to address the real topic behind that. So just make it enforce a person to address the reason, write it down, the reason why he wants to have these permissions. That's possible with privileged identity management. Maybe you can use something which is currently in preview, administrative units. So you are able to identify users and grant specific persons or groups, group of persons, the permissions to those administrative units for help desk, basically help desk tasks. When we have all these automatic processes established, implemented, please don't get the reports from the user about any issues. Try to get monitoring established. As I've mentioned it before, organizational changes, they are not able to get recognized from the technique behind that. There's no AI, as much as I know, who's able to identify any organizational changes. So think about that. What's necessary to address those organizational changes? Is there any restructure in the whole company? You may have to change some processes. And of course, technical changes, bandwidth, routing, whatever it is, you should monitor it and get some feedback also from your peers. When we take a look into the quality of experience, then we get some reports. This is a specific service from Teams in a cloud which is responsible to identify the call quality from different aspects, like sound was not good and network was not good, something like that, and you get a report about that. And you can get some details in those reports, but also you can raise some train the help desk to identify and raise the right questions in a call and get the feedback from the users directly. So for example, you can check if there are some issues with audio, and here you can see some examples where the help desk is also able to ask, have you had a VPN connection over there? Have you seen some calling some reports where the code dropped very often, then you can go into the reports and check what's the reason for that. Make some surveys. There are some surveys as well in Teams built in, so you can use them and get the experience from the users directly. And if you have any known issues, for example, their proxy is limiting the connection to the cloud in whatever way, and there are some changes on the proxy side, remediate these issues. Maybe they are gone and you can communicate it to users who are affected of this, or they maybe have some other side effects. Just check them and get in touch with the responsible person. When you think about Teams, you probably would think about network services, as I mentioned before, but also think about the clients, about the endpoints. You can use Teams on so many different endpoints, devices, from the mobile client to the desktop client, to Mac, to Linux, to browser, and even in something like Citrix. So you have to identify the standards you will support and clarify what's happening if some users use the wrong endpoint for that. For example, an older version of Citrix, and within Citrix, voice via browser. It's a really, really bad idea. That's it from my side. I think I've got it almost in time. So please get in touch. I would like to start with some Q&As. Check the Q&A area, see if any questions came up. And I will join the breakout session afterwards and ask you to rate my session. Thank you.
Fantastic,
so
Michael.
Let's see what it is.
No questions at this point in time. I'll go ahead and post the breakout link here into the Q&A for folks. So if folks want to join Michael and have more questions or have a deeper conversation versus just the Q&A panel, feel free to jump over to the breakout, and Michael, you can jump over there. But thank you so much for your time, and thank you for the great presentation.
You're very welcome. It was fun. I love this.
Awesome. Well, we'll let people jump over there, and I'll let you jump over there, and I'll end the live event now. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.